Indranee.
Question 17, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his question, as it highlights an area which some have misunderstood, leading to incorrect conclusions about our fiscal position and the need to raise GST. Let me explain why. There is a distinction between A, cash receipts, and B, revenue that is available for spending. Cash receipts reflect all the cash that comes in. Every year, the Department of Statistics, or DOS, reports our cash receipts and indicates whether we have a cash surplus or cash deficit. But not all our cash receipts constitute revenue available for spending. The largest difference between our cash receipts and revenue comes from the sale of state land. Such proceeds from land sales do not generate fresh revenue. They are simply a transformation of one asset to another. When land is sold, the asset is converted to cash. State land that are not due for immediate development are typically leased out for interim use. This yields revenue for the government too, in the form of rental income. So selling land does not increase the government's revenue, and if we were to spend all the proceeds from land, it would deplete our store of wealth. Think of a family that has a house. So long as the family owns the house, it can rent out some of the empty rooms to generate income. But if the family sells the house and uses the proceeds for day-to-day expenditure, it will soon have nothing left. However, if it invests the proceeds of sale wisely, it will still have the original sale proceeds plus a constant stream of income from those proceeds. This income can then be used partially for expenditure and partially reinvested to help sustain both present and future members of the family. Likewise, for government budgeting, land sales proceeds are not considered part of our revenue and cannot be directly used for expenditure. Instead, they are invested, and part of the investment income is used to support the spending needs of Singaporeans via the Net Investment Returns Contribution, or NIRC. The NIRC is now the largest single source of government revenue, supporting about 1/5 of our spending needs. This is only possible because of the prudent and disciplined approach we have taken to building and protecting both our land and financial reserves. In a recent social media post, the Workers' Party claimed that there is no need to raise GST because of the cash surplus. As I have explained, this claim is inaccurate and misleading. The bulk of our cash surpluses arise from land sales proceeds. Such cash proceeds do not create additional revenues for the government and are therefore not a valid reason for holding off the GST increase.
Indranee.
So I thank the Minister for his clarifications. Just one further related questions. Under the constitutions, the government is required to balance the budget over the term of the government. And so I want to ask the Minister whether this requirement, does it lead to the government being typically being more conservative in the budget during the early parts of the term, and then distribute and spend a bit more in the later part of the term? Do we have that phenomena because of the constitution requirements? Secondly, what's the government's policy or the policy approach or principles in the way we distribute our accumulated surplus accumulated during the term of government?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his supplementary question. The government seeks to run a balanced budget over the term of government by spending prudently within the limits of its annual revenues and any accumulated surpluses. The government has generally adhered to this in line with the constitutional requirement. In general, this means that we avoid running deficits early in the term of government. This is not only to avoid a draw on past reserves, which should be reserved for exceptional situations, it also helps the government to preserve fiscal headroom to deal with unexpected spending needs during its term of government. However, in the event of a major crisis, the government is prepared to run a deficit and seek a draw on past reserves, regardless of which part of the term it happens to be in. And that's exactly what we have done this year, because we have been facing one of the biggest crises of all. This year, the first full financial year of this term of government, we sought and obtained the President's approval to draw up to 11 billion for the continued fight against COVID-19. If and when we have unexpected surpluses, we have used them in three ways. First, we share some of the surpluses with Singaporeans. In FY 2018, we distributed up to $300 per Singaporean through the SG bonus, following an exceptional surplus in FY 2017 due to unexpected market movements that resulted in higher statutory board contributions from MAS. Second, we save for anticipated future needs, such as the Railway Infrastructure Fund and the Coastal and Flood Protection Fund. Last, any unutilized fiscal space becomes part of past reserves, which is invested and supports future spending needs via the net investment returns contribution.
Mr. Louis Chua.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, I would like to thank Member Mr. Liang for raising this question that we discussed during the budget, and of course for Minister for the elaboration. A number of clarifications from me. Firstly, in the PQ was asked about the fiscal space. And I recall in 2018 when the idea of the GST hike was first raised. If you look at the IMF Article 4 report that was published at that point in time, and looking at these taxes would reduce private income and consumption, especially of low-income households. A GST hike alone could lead to a lower path for GDP and private consumption and limited external adjustment relative to using more of the available fiscal space. And I think, again, in 2019, the IMF also said that Singapore has tended to overperform with respect to its fiscal rule of a balanced budget over the political cycle, contributing to a large build-up of net assets, suggesting that Singapore has substantial fiscal space. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the situation in 2018 versus today, where we have COVID-19, in terms of what is impacting the cost of living, if you look, the question that I have is the GST raising a regressive tax such as the GST really the best option for us in terms of raising revenues? Could there be other options that could be explored, for example, looking at the NRRC framework again? And I think this also brings me to the second clarification, which I also raised during the debate earlier in February, in that if you look at our reserves position today, we are looking at having drawn down about 20 years worth of surpluses. Some members have said that it's about 10 years. Where do our reserves stand today versus, say, the last 10 years or 5 years? And I think that would help us to adequately frame the context of this GST rise as well.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his clarification. He opened by saying that we had discussed this topic during the budget. Actually, we hadn't. During the budget, the Workers' Party touched peripherally on the budget. I believe Mr. Louis Chua mentioned land sales, but what the Workers' Party did not say during the budget debate was what they had said in their social media post. And in their social media post, what they had actually said was that the government says that the government expects a deficit of 11 billion, and they said the deficit should only be 3.5 billion. So effectively, in their social media post, what they're really saying is that the government is not setting out the correct fiscal position. The government has set out the correct fiscal position. We do expect in this year a deficit of 11 billion, and we have explained why. So essentially, in their social media posts, what the Workers' Party had done was to point just to cash surpluses. And as I explained earlier, you cannot look just at cash surpluses to understand the fiscal position. You also need to look whether or not all of that constitutes revenue under our budgeting rules. And as for the reasons I explained earlier, it does not. So that was the first point that I wanted to respond to the member, Mr. Louis Chua. Then the second point that he raised, I think, well, he went through quite a lot of things, but I think that the question that you ultimately came back to was, is the raising of GST the best option? I think after going through all what the IMF had said, etc., that was the question. And is it time to look at the NIRC formula again? This has been explained in some detail by the Deputy Prime Minister during the budget. And in fact, this question should have been brought up during the budget, because then it would have given the government the opportunity to explain the position. But in summary, we all know we are so badly constrained. Because of COVID-19, we already have to go into actual reserves. We have to dip into actual reserves. It's no longer just a question of taking from income on the reserves. We are squeezed on the corporate tax front. Because of the economic situation, you're going to have a scenario where even your personal income tax is going to be affected. So GST is one of the options that we have, but because we know that GST does have an impact on the lower income and the vulnerable, we take steps to deal with that. So as DPM explained earlier, actually 60% of our GST revenue comes from tourists and from the higher income. But we do know that middle income, lower income is affected, which is why we set aside the $6 billion assurance package, which will effectively buffer the majority of Singaporeans for 5 years against the increase, and the lower income for 10 years. And with respect to the last question, I think when we look at our reserve position, we've already explained all of that in the budget statements and the roundup speeches. It's not necessary for me to go into that. But essentially, our formula for spending of the returns is a fair one. 50% of returns, because there's no magic to this formula, but it's a fair formula, 50% for today's generation and another 50% for tomorrow's generation.
Mr. Louis Chua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for the elaboration. I think the first point is that actually during my speech, I did set out in terms of the revenues and expenditure, as well as how I actually arrived at some of these numbers. But I think the question is really also about whether or not looking at this NIRC framework, that is something that we can revisit again. I mean, as I agree with Minister that because of COVID-19, this has actually impacted a lot of Singaporeans, a lot of corporates. And I think all the more, I think a regressive tax such as GST, I think that should be something that we should reconsider, because while the assurance package could offset the impact of the increase of 2% for a number of years, I think this is going to stick with them for the rest of, basically for the rest of their lives. And if you look at, I think I recall Minister Lawrence Wong mentioning in 2018 that we should never say never. So, I mean, if you look at the past constitution amendments that we have done in 1991, I think this was when the Reserve Protection Framework was introduced. 2001, we had the Net Investment Income Framework. 2008, NRR Framework. And in 2015, the Temasek was included in the NRR Framework as well. So, given the impact of COVID-19 and all on the livelihoods of Singaporeans, the men on the street, could we not look at the NIRC framework again as perhaps another measure, given where our reserves have been? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, again, I thank the member for his supplementary question. In essence, what the member is saying is this. He's saying that you have the NIRC framework. Can we not relook it? Now, we all know that things are not set in stone always, but we also know that when it comes to a matter of public policy and when you have frameworks, especially frameworks for expenditure, you cannot just chop and change every other year. So it would make instructive reading for members and anybody who is interested in this to actually go back to the time when we did set up the framework. And this was dealt with in the speech by Prime Minister when we did the amendments. And it's a very instructive speech. Let me just read some parts of it. He said, Parliament is considering an important constitutional amendment to our reserves framework. The immediate issue before us is just a formula change. How much income can the government draw from the past reserves? We're changing the formula. The new formula will allow us to spend somewhat more, but the deeper significance of this amendment is to establish a more sustainable and equitable basis for spending out of the investment returns. Sustainable and equitable so that we have resources which can benefit both the present generation and future generations. While we spend for our needs, we also put aside a solid buffer for contingencies for the proverbial rainy day. That is the deeper meaning. But the most fundamental significance of this amendment is that it affirms the importance of protecting our reserves. And in that speech, the Prime Minister takes us through the history of how originally it was just protecting the principal amount. Then after that, we had the NII framework, and we spent 100% of that. Then we went to 50%. And the last amendment really encapsulated the formula that we want to use, or the principle, which is that on the returns, we use 50% for now, 50% for later. So I cannot say whether 50 or 100 years from now we change that. But what we should not do is just every year or every 2 years when something looks like this, the scenario will need a bit more expenditure, we just change the framework so easily. The framework took a long time to come to, and it was very carefully considered and thought through, tried and tested many steps. And once you have a framework in place, you should not easily change it. But, and this is the real point which I have mentioned, we know that there is an impact on lower income and middle income, which is why we have taken the steps that I mentioned earlier. The member talks about the buffer or the assurance package will last for 5 years and 10 years, but the impact will be longer than that. Don't forget, we have also said that we will enhance the permanent GST voucher scheme when the GST rate is raised. This will provide a permanent cushion for lower and middle income households, even after the temporary support ends. And also, over 5 and 10 years, there is time for incomes to rise. So it's been thought through very carefully, understanding that there is an impact on middle income and lower income, but we have taken the steps to ameliorate that, to buffer that, to make sure that they are okay. But this still brings me back to the point I started off with, which is that it is not correct to suggest that because we have a certain amount of cash surpluses, that our fiscal position is better than we have stated, or that we do not need to raise GST.